The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the small house, there was a sense of quiet peace. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. They had found a place to call home, and nothing could take that away. It was just the beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. 3% commission to translate this, the billionaire said with an air of casual authority, as he handed the young girl a thick stack of papers. His words echoed in the room, and for a brief moment, the conversations around them ceased. The girl's name was Maya, and she was the maid's daughter, not more than 12 years old, but her presence seemed to command attention. The fine silk of her dress was worn and faded, and her shoes, scuffed from long days of running errands, clicked quietly on the polished marble floor. She stood still, her small hands trembling slightly as she held the papers. The guests around her whispered, casting glances at the little girl in disbelief, as if her very existence in the grand ballroom was an anomaly. Maya swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been in a room like this before, filled with wealth, power, and people who barely noticed her existence. But she had learned to hide her fear. She had learned that in this world, you needed more than courage to survive. You needed dignity, even if it was all you had. The billionaire, oblivious to the stir his words had caused, leaned back in his chair, sipping his drink. His eyes never left Maya, waiting for her to comply. The grand ballroom echoed with the soft clinking of glasses, the murmur of polite conversation, and the gentle rustle of fine fabrics as the guests mingled under the golden chandeliers. At the center of the room stood a billionaire, known for his cold demeanor and sharp business acumen. Yet today his eyes were fixed on the small figure standing in front of him. This was no ordinary girl, they realized. She was someone who would not be dismissed. The billionaire's smug expression faltered, but he quickly masked it with a smile, trying to regain control of the situation. Yet Maya's words had already done their work. She was not just translating the words on the page. She was translating something far more powerful, the truth. The truth that no amount of wealth or status could erase the dignity of a person, no matter their station. The room grew tense, the hum of the conversations fading as people watched. Maya hesitated for only a moment. She looked down at the papers, then back up at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and began to speak. Her voice was quiet but clear, each word pronounced with care. As she spoke, the tension in the room shifted. People began to listen, not just to her words, but to the confidence with which she said them. He had watched her translate the document, each word falling from her lips with precision, but something about Maya's gaze unsettled him. The room had been quiet as she spoke, her voice steady and clear, yet in that silence, something had changed. The power dynamics in the room had shifted, and for the first time, the billionaire felt the weight of his own arrogance. "It's just a translation," he muttered to himself, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. The murmurs of the crowd began to rise again, whispers swirling like a storm around them. The girl's eyes remained locked on him, unmoving, unwavering. Maya had done more than simply translate the words on the page. She had translated a truth that he had long ignored, and it was a truth that struck him deeply. It was a truth that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of wealth, power, and status. But now, in the quiet after her words, he couldn't escape it. Finally, Maya spoke. "I didn't do it for your respect," she said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." The billionaire nodded, a sense of humility washing over him. "I understand," he said, "and I want to help. I want to make sure you're not dismissed again. You deserve more than what the world has given you." They all seemed to have fallen silent, as if they, too, were waiting for something to happen. The young girl stood there, her posture straight, her hands now clasped in front of her. She hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't backed down. Maya had spoken not just with her words, but with her presence, with the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. Her dignity was her shield, and in that moment, she wielded it better than anyone in the room. "You did well," the billionaire finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. Maya didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting something he hadn't seen in years. Respect. It was a respect that he had not earned. A respect that he had never given to anyone in his life, not truly. As the room held its breath, Maya finished her translation. She looked up at the billionaire, her eyes unwavering. There was a moment of silence, before the billionaire slowly stood up, his expression unreadable. But the power in the room had shifted, and Maya, the maid's black daughter, had stunned him in a way that no amount of money or influence ever could. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around his glass, a smile playing at the edges of his lips. It wasn't the defiance in her voice that caught him off guard, it was the quiet confidence, the certainty with which she spoke. It was as if she had already known her worth, even if no one else did. He opened his mouth to respond, but found that he had no words. The truth that Maya had revealed was too raw, too real. It cut through the layers of his carefully constructed world, leaving him exposed. In that moment, the billionaire saw her not just as the maid's daughter, but as a person with a strength that he had never known. The guests in the room had begun to shift uneasily, their whispers growing louder again, but the billionaire's attention was solely on Maya. Her words had planted a seed that he wasn't sure he could ignore. For the first time in his life, he felt small. The power that he had once wielded with ease seemed distant, unreachable. It was as if he had been awakened from a long, selfish dream. As the night wore on, the billionaire found himself unable to shake the image of Maya standing in front of him, her unwavering gaze challenging everything he had believed. He had built empires, dominated markets, but he had never once stopped to consider the dignity of others. Now, he realized how much he had missed. His world, so full of wealth and power, seemed empty, and he wasn't sure how to fill it. The truth had been spoken by a child, a girl whose life was so different from his own, and yet, in her words, he had found something he had been searching for all his life purpose. Maya had given him a glimpse of something greater, something beyond the world he had built. As the night came to an end, the billionaire's mind was no longer consumed with his next deal, his next investment, or his next conquest. It was consumed with something far more elusive, the realization that dignity was something that could not be bought, something that could not be earned with money, but something that could only be given. And for the first time in his life, he began to wonder if he had been looking for the wrong thing all along. In the days that followed, the billionaire's thoughts were consumed by the encounter with Maya. His world, which once revolved around figures, deals, and markets, now seemed meaningless in comparison to the quiet strength she had shown. As he sat in his office, surrounded by the cold steel and glass of his empire, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wrong about everything. Maya had not just translated a document, she had opened his eyes to something he had ignored for years, the power of dignity, of standing firm in one's truth. It had been a simple thing, a child's courage, but it had shaken him to his core. The billionaire had never seen anyone, especially someone like Maya, so unyielding in the face of everything he represented. He had been the man who owned everything, who called the shots, who bent the world to his will. But in that moment, he had felt small, vulnerable. It was a feeling he had long buried beneath his wealth and his success. He had spent years building walls around himself, convincing himself that money and power were all that mattered. But now, Maya's words echoed in his mind. "I won't be dismissed." He couldn't forget her eyes, her unwavering gaze. For the first time, he wondered if he had dismissed everyone who didn't look like him or live like him. He had built a world that rewarded those who fit into it. But what about those who didn't? What about the ones like Maya? As he sat in the silence of his office, the billionaire realized that he couldn't continue down the same path. The truth Maya had spoken was undeniable. He had spent his life looking for success, but he had never truly considered what success meant. It was clear now that there was more to life than just wealth. Success wasn't just about what you could buy or own. It was about the respect you earned and the dignity you gave to others. The billionaire knew he had to change, but he didn't know where to begin. His empire had been built on the idea that power was everything, that you could buy respect, that money could solve all problems. But Maya had shown him the flaw in that thinking. He had dismissed people like her, people who were invisible to him, because they didn't have anything he valued: money, status, influence. But now, he saw them differently. He began to question his own motivations. Was he truly a man of power, or had he been living in a bubble of his own creation? He thought back to the moments in the ballroom when Maya had stood in front of him, translating the document with such poise. She hadn't begged for his attention or approval. She hadn't cowered in fear. She had simply stood her ground, and in doing so, she had earned his respect. The truth that, despite all his success, he had never truly understood the value of dignity. The billionaire's mind raced. He had lived his life thinking that money could solve everything, that status could silence anyone who dared to challenge him. But this girl, this maid's daughter, had exposed the fragility of his world. He looked around the room, half expecting to see the others share his unease. But no one met his eyes. And now, as he thought about it, he realized that this was the moment of change he had been waiting for. He had to make things right. He couldn't just go on living the way he had. It wasn't enough to be powerful. He had to be something more. The next day, the billionaire found himself at the maid's apartment, standing outside the small building that Maya called home. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew that he had to start somewhere. He knocked on the door, and Maya's mother answered, her expression wary but polite. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes flicking behind him to the street, as if unsure of his intentions. The billionaire took a deep breath. "I need to speak with Maya," he said. The mother hesitated but then stepped aside, allowing him into the modest apartment. Maya was sitting at the kitchen table, working on her homework. She looked up in surprise when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice guarded. The billionaire cleared his throat, feeling out of place in the small, cramped space. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "For how I treated you before. I was wrong, and I need you to know that I respect you. I respect your dignity, and I want to make things right." Maya didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. The billionaire waited, unsure of what to expect. Finally, Maya spoke. "I didn't do it for your respect," she said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." The billionaire nodded, a sense of humility washing over him. "I understand," he said, "and I want to help. I want to make sure you're not dismissed again. You deserve more than what the world has given you." Maya didn't answer, but for the first time, the billionaire felt like he was seeing her, truly seeing her, not just as the maid's daughter but as someone with a future that was not defined by the world he had built. In that moment, the billionaire knew that he was going to change, not just for himself, but for others like Maya, who had been overlooked for far too long. The billionaire stood at the entrance of the small apartment, his mind racing. He had never felt more out of place in his entire life. The walls, painted in pale colors, held memories of a life much different from his own. The modest furniture and the worn carpet seemed to echo the quiet dignity Maya had shown him just days earlier. As he stepped inside, he felt the weight of his past decisions pressing on him. He had lived his life thinking that power, wealth, and influence were all that mattered. But Maya had shattered that illusion. Her words, her strength, her unwillingness to be dismissed had changed everything for him. Now, standing in this humble space, he realized just how far removed he had been from the real world. He wasn't the man he had thought he was. He wasn't the man who had all the answers, the man who controlled everything around him. Maya had shown him that. Maya's mother, a woman with weary eyes but a soft smile, led him to the small kitchen table where Maya sat, her homework spread out before her. The room smelled faintly of old wood and fresh coffee, a far cry from the polished offices and luxury cars the billionaire was used to. Maya glanced up as he approached, her expression guarded, as if she expected him to say something that would make everything feel like an act again. But the billionaire had no words of arrogance left. He had come here to speak from the heart, not from a place of power. For the first time, the billionaire realized that there were people who didn't need to be validated by the world. They had already validated themselves. Maya was one of them. The realization hit him hard. He had spent so much of his life trying to accumulate more wealth, more power, more influence, but it was all fleeting. In the end, none of it mattered. Maya had given him something that money could never buy: perspective. "Maya," he began, his voice steady but low, "I know I have no right to ask this of you, but I want to help you. I've been wrong in so many ways, and I need to make it right." Maya didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at him, her eyes unblinking. Her posture was calm, but there was a slight tension in her shoulders that told him she was waiting for something real. The billionaire continued, "I've spent my life building empires, chasing wealth, chasing recognition. I don't need your approval, and I don't need you to feel sorry for me. I'm doing just fine on my own." The billionaire felt a pang in his chest. Her words were direct, but there was no bitterness in her tone. There was only clarity. Maya didn't need him, or anyone else, to validate her existence. She had already validated herself. "I know," he said quietly, his gaze falling to the table. "I'm not here to give you charity. I'm here to offer you something else. I can help you get the education you deserve. I can help you get the opportunities that have always been out of your reach. I can offer you a chance to make a difference, to use your strength, to change the world, like you've already changed mine." Maya looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. He wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't about him. It was about her, and it always had been. After what seemed like an eternity, Maya spoke again. "I don't want handouts, but I do want to make something of myself. I want to help people, to make a difference, just like you said, but I don't want to be part of your world. Not the way you think I should be. I want to do it my way." The billionaire nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. He had spent his life telling people what they should want, what they should need, but Maya had just reminded him that everyone has their own path. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I'll help you on your path, however you choose to walk it." Maya didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition of the change that had taken place, not just in the billionaire, but in the world around her. The billionaire knew that he could never undo the years of ignorance, the years of looking down on people like Maya. But he could do something now. He could offer her a chance at a future, one where her worth wasn't determined by her circumstances, but by her strength, her intelligence, and her courage. Maya didn't need him to solve her problems. She had already done that for herself. But the billionaire could offer her something he hadn't offered anyone else before. A partnership, not based on power or money, but on mutual respect. "I'll be here," the billionaire said, standing up to leave. "Whenever you need me, whenever you're ready, I'll be here. You're not alone in this." As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Maya, who was already focused on her homework again. But this time, she wasn't just a girl trying to survive in a world that had overlooked her. She was a force. And he, for the first time, understood that he was no longer the only one with power. She had her own. And it was something no amount of wealth could buy. The billionaire walked out of the small apartment with a heavy heart. The conversation with Maya had not gone as he expected. It wasn't about charity or pity. It was about respect, about seeing people for who they truly were and not just as parts of a system. As he stepped out onto the street, the cool evening air hit him, sharp and biting, but he barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere, consumed with the weight of what he had just experienced. For so long, he had lived his life in the bubble of luxury, detached from the struggles of people like Maya. Now, standing in front of her humble apartment, he realized how out of touch he had been. The world he had built, the empire of wealth and influence, was nothing more than a facade. What Maya had shown him was far more valuable: true strength, self-worth, and dignity. He had promised her mother that he would help, but it was clear now that help would look different than what he had initially imagined. He couldn't just offer her money or opportunities in the way he thought. Maya had made it clear that she didn't want that. She didn't want to be saved, at least not in the way he thought she needed saving. What Maya wanted was to stand on her own, to carve out her own path, and to be respected for the strength and determination she had always shown. As the billionaire walked through the city streets, he felt the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking him out of his thoughts. It was his assistant, reminding him of a high-stakes meeting with a potential business partner. Normally, he would have jumped at the opportunity to focus on work, to lose himself in the deals and the numbers that defined his success. But now, the meeting felt insignificant. It wasn't the deals that mattered anymore. It wasn't the billion-dollar contracts or the luxury homes that filled his thoughts. What mattered was Maya. What mattered was understanding the lesson she had taught him, that real power didn't come from wealth or influence. It came from the ability to stand firm, to speak your truth, and to never allow anyone to diminish your worth. The billionaire arrived at his office building, but instead of heading straight up to his usual floor, he found himself pausing in front of the elevator. The cold glass walls of the building seemed to mock him, a reminder of everything he had built. He stepped into the elevator, but as it ascended, he found himself thinking of Maya again. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about her ever since their conversation. What she had shown him wasn't just about personal dignity, it was about the dignity of every person, regardless of their station in life. The world didn't need more people with power, it needed more people with integrity. It needed people who understood that wealth and influence didn't define a person's worth. As the billionaire entered the meeting room, he couldn't shake the thought of Maya's face. He was surrounded by potential business partners, all of them eager to discuss investments and growth. But as they spoke, he found himself distant, his mind elsewhere. He kept thinking of the small apartment, the humble surroundings, and the quiet strength in Maya's eyes. After the meeting ended, he sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the city below. It was as if everything had changed in an instant. The work that had once consumed him now felt meaningless. The numbers, the deals, the meetings, they all seemed to fade into the background. He thought of Maya's words, "I'm doing just fine on my own." The billionaire understood now. She didn't need his money or his help in the way he thought she did. She needed something far more valuable: recognition, respect, and the space to grow on her own terms. He thought about how many others there were in the world, people who had been overlooked, people who had never been given a chance because they didn't fit into the mold of success that he had always believed in. How many people had he dismissed over the years? How many had he overlooked because they didn't have the right background, the right status, the right connections? The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been living in a world that defined people by their wealth, their position, their success. But that wasn't the world Maya lived in. Maya lived in a world where dignity, strength, and resilience were the true measures of a person's worth. And in that world, she was a giant. The billionaire stood up from his desk and walked to the window. He looked out over the city, the sprawling metropolis that had once felt like a symbol of his success. But now, it felt empty. He had been part of a system that had allowed him to rise above others, but it was clear to him now that real success wasn't about rising above, it was about lifting others up. It was about giving people the tools, the opportunities, and the respect they needed to stand on their own. He made a decision then. He couldn't change everything in an instant, but he could start with one person. He could start with Maya, and in doing so, he could begin to change the world, one person at a time. The billionaire spent the next few days consumed by his thoughts, a feeling of unease settling over him like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just the decisions he had made in the past that bothered him, it was the weight of what he had yet to do. Maya had shown him a truth that was impossible to ignore, that real change couldn't come from just offering help in the way he thought it should be given. No amount of wealth or power could change the core issue of dignity, of respect. He had promised her that he would help, but now, he realized that this wasn't a simple transaction. It wasn't just about giving her opportunities or money. It was about giving her the freedom to choose her own path, to define her own worth without anyone telling her what she could or couldn't do. The billionaire knew this realization was only the beginning. He needed to learn more, to understand more, if he was truly going to change. And so, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would go back to the roots of his empire, not to the boardrooms or the meetings, but to the very foundation of what had built his success: the people, the workers, the ones who made everything possible but were often unseen, overlooked. He would listen to them, he would learn from them, and he would use the power he had to help them, not in the way he thought they needed, but in the way they truly deserved. The billionaire called his assistant, his voice steady, though a new sense of purpose had taken root within him. "I need you to gather a list of all the employees across the company. I want to meet with them. All of them. I need to hear their stories." His assistant hesitated for a moment, no doubt confused by the request, but she complied. Over the next few days, the billionaire traveled to various locations, from factories to offices, from warehouses to construction sites. He stood among the people who had built his empire, people who had toiled away in the background, barely acknowledged, their hard work fueling the success that he had enjoyed. At first, the workers were hesitant. They didn't know who he was or why he was there. They had never seen the billionaire in person. He had always been a distant figure, someone whose name was spoken but whose face was rarely seen. But as he spoke to them, as he listened to their stories, the tension in the air began to dissipate. He didn't come with promises or speeches. He came with a simple request. Tell me about your life. What do you need? What do you want? The workers, at first, were unsure of what to make of him, but as he sat with them, listened to their concerns, and asked meaningful questions, they began to open up. They shared stories of hardship, of dreams deferred, of hopes that seemed out of reach. Some spoke of their struggles to provide for their families. Others talked about the lack of opportunities for growth within the company. One man, a janitor who had worked for the Billionaire's company for over 20 years, shared his frustrations about being passed over for promotion time and time again. Another woman, a cashier, spoke about how she had been forced to work long hours for little pay, never having the chance to spend time with her children. These stories were raw and painful, but they were also real. And for the first time in his life, the billionaire truly understood them. He realized that these were the voices that had been missing from his world, the voices that he had ignored in favor of profits and deals. As the days went on, he continued his journey, visiting more and more people in his company. He asked questions, he listened, and most importantly, he learned. He learned about the systemic issues that kept his employees in poverty, the inequities that prevented them from achieving their full potential. He learned about the struggles of working parents, the difficulty of balancing work and life, and the lack of resources for people who needed help. And with each story, a new sense of responsibility grew inside him. He couldn't just sit in his office anymore and pretend that everything was fine. He couldn't continue to build his empire without considering the cost of the people who made it all possible. The billionaire knew that change would not come overnight. He understood that the systems in place were deeply entrenched and would take time to shift. But he also knew that he had the power to begin making a difference. He returned to his office, his mind swirling with new ideas. He couldn't undo the past, but he could start creating a future where dignity, respect, and opportunity were available to everyone, not just a select few. He began drafting a new initiative for the company, one that focused not just on profits, but on the people who made those profits possible. He would implement programs to provide better wages, opportunities for advancement, and support for workers who needed help balancing work and life. He would create a company culture where people were seen, heard, and respected for who they were, not just for what they could produce. The billionaire's new path had begun. It was a path that would be difficult, one that would challenge everything he had believed about success and power. But it was a path worth taking. He knew that if he wanted to truly make a difference, it had to start with him. And so, he made a vow to himself and to the people who had trusted him with their lives. He would not stop until the world he helped create was one where everyone, regardless of their background, could stand with dignity and pride. The billionaire had spent days reflecting on his newfound purpose, but as he stood at the foot of the towering office building, a sense of dread filled him. He had spent a lifetime in the world of high-stakes deals, only to realize that the greatest challenge of all lay in changing not just his own life, but the lives of countless others. The changes he had promised, the initiatives he had planned, had to be real. They couldn't be empty words or vague commitments. They had to be tangible, impactful. But with every step he took toward this new path, the pressure mounted. He was about to confront the reality of his promises. He was about to face the true test of his transformation. Inside his office, the billionaire sat at his desk, staring at the list of reforms he had compiled over the past few days. His heart pounded in his chest, each item on the list seeming more daunting than the last. He had spoken to the workers, listened to their stories, and now he had to act. The reality of change was far more difficult than he had anticipated. He had spoken about dignity and respect, but now he had to make them a priority, even if it meant challenging everything he had built. As he sifted through the list, his phone rang. It was his assistant, calling to remind him about the meeting with the board of directors later that day. The very same board that had been with him throughout his rise to power. They had been part of the system that had overlooked the workers, the ones who had toiled behind the scenes to make his empire thrive. He hadn't been looking forward to this meeting. He knew that it would be a challenge. He would have to convince the board to support these new changes, to back the initiatives that prioritize people over profits. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. He couldn't go back to the way things were. He couldn't be the same person who had dismissed people like Maya and her mother, or the workers who had trusted him. As the billionaire walked into the boardroom, he was met with the familiar faces of the people who had once held the power. They were all men and women who had been with him from the beginning, who had built the empire alongside him. They were the ones who had always prioritized growth and profits, who had turned a blind eye to the struggles of the people below them. As he stood before them, the billionaire felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. This was the moment where he would either gain their support or lose it. He had no guarantees. The board members exchanged looks, murmuring among themselves, clearly surprised to see the billionaire so serious. He had always been the one to lead them, to steer them toward greater profits and success. But today, he was asking them to follow him down a new path, a path that prioritized people over profits. "I've been thinking a lot about where we've come from," the billionaire began, his voice steady but resolute. "We've built something incredible, but I've come to realize that we've done so at the expense of the people who made it all possible. The workers. The people who have dedicated their lives to this company, to this empire." The room fell silent, and the billionaire could see the surprise in their eyes. They had never heard him speak like this before. He continued, "I've spent my life focused on numbers, on deals, on what's going to make us more money. But I've overlooked the people behind it all, and that ends now." The board members shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. They had always known that the billionaire was a force to be reckoned with, but this was something different. This was a man who was questioning everything he had built. "I'm proposing a new initiative," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "A program that will provide better wages, more opportunities for advancement, and support for employees who are struggling. A program that will focus on dignity, respect, and fairness. I want to create a culture where every worker, no matter their role, feels valued." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. This was not what they had signed up for. They had built this empire on the foundation of profits, not people. But the billionaire wasn't finished. "I know this isn't going to be easy," he said, his voice unwavering. "But I also know it's the right thing to do. We can't keep building something that only benefits a few. We have a responsibility to the people who've made this all possible." The tension in the room was palpable. The board members remained silent, but their eyes were fixed on him, waiting for him to continue. The billionaire stood tall, knowing that he had no choice but to push forward. "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm asking for your commitment. This is the direction we're going, and if you can't support it, then we'll part ways. But if you believe in this company, in the people who work for us, then you'll join me in making this change." There was a long pause, the silence thick with anticipation. Finally, one of the board members, a man who had been with the billionaire from the very beginning, spoke up. "I don't know if this is going to work," he said, his voice hesitant. "But if you believe in it, then I'll follow you." One by one, the other members slowly nodded in agreement. It wasn't easy. It wasn't the decision they had been expecting. But they understood something now that they hadn't before. They understood that the billionaire's vision wasn't just about building an empire, it was about making it a place where people mattered. And that, in the end, was more valuable than anything money could buy. Days passed since the board meeting, and the billionaire felt a new weight on his shoulders. The changes had been set in motion, and the realization hit him harder than ever before. This was just the beginning. He had done the easy part, speaking his truth, laying the foundation for change, but the hard part was yet to come. Implementing the changes, convincing his employees that this wasn't just a fleeting gesture, but a true commitment to their futures that was the real test. It wasn't going to be simple. There were years of inequality, years of workers being overlooked, years of living under a system that only valued profits. But Maya had shown him that real change had to come from the ground up, and he was determined to follow through. The billionaire spent the next few weeks traveling, visiting different parts of the company, meeting with employees face to face. He wanted to understand their struggles, their frustrations, and their hopes. He knew the words he had spoken to the board were just the beginning. The workers had to see that the changes weren't just about better pay or perks. They were about restoring their dignity, giving them a voice. In one of the smaller warehouses, he met an elderly man who had worked in the company for nearly 40 years. His name was Arthur, and his hands were rough from years of labor. Arthur had never expected much in life, but he had always hoped for a bit of respect, a recognition of his hard work. "We've been doing the same thing for years, but never once have I felt like I mattered," Arthur said, his voice weary but clear. "I'm just a cog in the machine, that's all. They never even ask how we're doing. They just expect the work to get done." The billionaire listened intently, feeling a deep sense of responsibility for Arthur's words. He had never truly understood the weight of the system he had helped build, the system that had dehumanized people like Arthur. This was no longer about business. This was about human beings. "I promise you," the billionaire said quietly, "things are going to change. You won't be overlooked anymore." Arthur looked at him, skeptical but hopeful. "I've heard promises before," he said. "We'll see if you keep yours." The billionaire left the warehouse with a heavy heart. He understood Arthur's skepticism. He had made empty promises before, but now he had to prove himself. He had to show the workers that their voices mattered, that their contributions were valued. The next week, the billionaire held a meeting with the company's leadership team, discussing the specifics of the new initiative. The plan was ambitious: higher wages, better health care, more opportunities for advancement, and most importantly, a platform for workers to voice their concerns without fear of retribution. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be resistance. Some of the leaders were hesitant, unsure if these changes would negatively impact the company's bottom line. But the billionaire was firm. "This isn't just about numbers," he said. "This is about building something that lasts, something that doesn't crumble when we look away from the people who make it work. This is about making sure that when we succeed, we all succeed." The leadership team was still unsure, but they saw the determination in his eyes. They had worked with him for years, and they knew when he was serious. But as the meetings went on, the reality of the changes began to settle in. They had to rethink the way they operated. They had to put people first, not profits. That meant making some tough decisions. It meant questioning long-held beliefs about what it meant to run a successful business. The billionaire spent hours meeting with department heads, discussing how they could implement the new policies, how they could create a more inclusive, supportive environment. He met with the HR team to discuss how they could ensure fair hiring practices and create opportunities for growth for everyone, not just the ones at the top. He even went so far as to create a new internal committee made up of workers from every level of the company, ensuring that their voices would be heard and their concerns would be addressed. It was a massive shift, but it was a shift that was necessary. Over the next few months, the changes began to take effect. Workers noticed the difference. They were treated with more respect, their concerns were heard, and their work was recognized. The company culture started to change. Employees felt valued, and as a result, productivity and morale increased. The billionaire's efforts were paying off, but there was still so much work to be done. As the months passed, the billionaire made it his mission to continue visiting the workers, to continue listening to their stories, to make sure the changes he had promised were actually happening. He knew that he could never undo the past, but he could shape the future. He could create a company that didn't just succeed, it thrived on the respect and dignity of its people. One day, as he walked through the company's headquarters, he was stopped by a young woman named Sophia, who worked in customer service. She had been one of the first employees to speak out when the new initiatives were announced. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said with a smile, "for actually listening to us, for giving us a voice. I've been here for 5 years, and for the first time, I feel like I matter." The billionaire smiled, his heart swelling with pride. It wasn't just about the numbers. It wasn't just about the business. It was about making people feel valued, about creating a workplace where dignity was the foundation. "Thank you," he said. "You're the reason we're doing this." And as he walked away, he knew that Maya's lesson had finally taken root in him. This wasn't just about changing the company. It was about changing the world. The billionaire knew that the changes he had initiated were far from complete, but there was a feeling of progress in the air. The company had started to evolve, its culture shifting, and for the first time in his life, he could see the potential for real, meaningful change. Yet, he knew that the journey wasn't over. The true test of his commitment would come in the next few weeks, when the reality of these changes would be put to the test. He had laid the foundation, but now it was time for everyone to see if the system could sustain the new direction. As he walked through the company's headquarters, he reflected on how far he had come. There were still some who questioned his motives, still whispers in the hallways. But more and more, the workers were beginning to feel a sense of hope. They were seeing the results of the new policies: better wages, more opportunities for advancement, and, most importantly, a company culture that respected their dignity. The transformation wasn't just visible on paper. It was evident in the eyes of the employees who now felt seen and heard. The billionaire had visited every department, every warehouse, every office. He had listened, asked questions, and, most importantly, had acted on the feedback he had received. But it wasn't always easy. There were moments when the pressure of change felt like too much to bear. The systems that had been in place for decades didn't change overnight, and there were still battles to fight. Some of the long-standing executives, the ones who had grown comfortable with the old way of doing things, were resistant. They didn't understand the importance of what the billionaire was trying to build. Some of them even doubted the long-term success of the new initiatives. But with each passing day, as the workers continued to show their dedication and commitment to the company, the billionaire's belief in the new direction grew stronger. He couldn't back down now. He had made promises to the people, and he wasn't going to break them. One morning, as he arrived at the office, he was greeted by a surprise. Maya was waiting for him. She had come to visit the headquarters, and the billionaire was immediately struck by how much she had grown in confidence. She stood tall, a calm determination in her eyes. She wasn't the same girl he had met months ago, the girl who had only hoped for a better life. She was now a force in her own right. "I wanted to thank you," Maya said, her voice steady and clear. "You didn't have to do all of this, but you did, and you've changed everything. You've changed the way we look at ourselves, the way we look at each other. You've made us believe that we matter." The billionaire felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had made so many mistakes in his life, but hearing Maya's words made him feel as if the sacrifices had been worth it. "You did this," he replied. "You showed me the way. You taught me what true power is. It's not in wealth or influence. It's in standing up for what's right and lifting others up." Maya smiled, but there was something else in her eyes, a sense of pride, but also a quiet challenge. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We can't stop here. There's more work to be done. There are still so many who don't have the opportunities we do, who still feel invisible. We can't forget them." The billionaire nodded. He knew she was right. The work was far from finished. The company had made progress, but the world outside these walls still needed change. And that change wasn't just going to come from policies or initiatives. It had to come from the people. It had to come from a movement that started with the small things, the little acts of kindness, the moments when people stood up for each other, when they refused to let anyone be left behind. That was the true transformation he had started. "You're right," the billionaire said, his voice filled with resolve. "There's still so much to do. But together, we'll make sure the changes we've started go beyond these walls. We'll make sure that everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, has the chance to be seen, to be heard, and to stand with dignity." Over the next few weeks, the billionaire worked tirelessly to ensure the new initiatives were firmly in place. He traveled the country to meet with other business leaders, pushing them to adopt similar policies, to create workplaces that valued people over profits. He met with government officials to advocate for fairer labor laws and better support systems for workers. And all the while, Maya continued to lead the charge, her influence growing with each passing day. She had become a symbol of the change that was taking place, a reminder that one person's courage could spark a movement that touched the lives of many. As the billionaire stood at the podium at a national business conference, preparing to give a speech about the importance of valuing workers, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about creating a legacy of compassion, dignity, and respect. It was about making the world a better place, one person at a time. "This is just the beginning," the billionaire said, his voice steady and strong. "But together, we can create a world where everyone has the chance to stand tall, to live with dignity, and to know their worth. And that," he paused, looking out at the crowd, "is the future I'm committed to building." The billionaire stood in front of the glass window of his penthouse, looking out over the city. The skyline stretched out before him, the lights twinkling in the distance. The world he had once ruled, the world of wealth and influence, now felt distant, almost irrelevant. He had achieved so much in his career, his empire was vast, his influence immeasurable, but none of that mattered in the same way it once had. The truth he had discovered through Maya's courage, through the workers' stories, was more valuable than anything money could buy. He had begun to rebuild his company, reshaping it into something that not only generated profit but also honored the dignity of the people who helped build it. Still, he knew that the work was far from over. There were still those who didn't believe in the changes, who saw his transformation as a fleeting gesture. He needed to prove that this was not just a momentary shift, but a new way of doing business, a new way of living. As he prepared to make his speech at the annual business summit, the billionaire reflected on the journey that had brought him here. It had started with a simple encounter with Maya, the maid's daughter, who had shown him the raw power of dignity and self-worth. It had escalated into a movement, one that was transforming the very fabric of his company, one that was setting a new standard for how businesses should treat their employees. And now, it was about to take center stage on the world's biggest platform. He stood backstage, the sound of murmurs and applause echoing from the crowd. His speech was ready, but his heart was racing. He had never been nervous about speaking before a crowd, but this time was different. This wasn't about selling an idea, about pushing for a deal. This was about something far more personal. This was about showing the world that success didn't have to come at the expense of people's dignity. When he was called to the stage, he walked out slowly, his steps deliberate, his mind focused. He could feel the eyes of the audience on him, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. But as he stood at the podium, his gaze swept over the crowd, and something inside him shifted. This was no longer about impressing anyone. This was about sharing the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but carrying a new sense of conviction. "I stand before you today not as a businessman with a fortune, but as a man who has learned something invaluable. I have learned that true success is not measured in profits, not in power, not in status. It is measured in the respect we show each other, in the dignity we offer to those who are often overlooked." The room fell silent, the audience hanging on his every word. For too long, I was blinded by my own success. I saw people as tools, as numbers, as means to an end. I never saw them as people until one person, a young girl named Maya, opened my eyes. She taught me what it means to stand up for what's right, to never let anyone diminish your worth, no matter how small you may seem in the eyes of the world. Maya changed my life. He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. I started this journey thinking I could change a company. But I've learned that what we're really changing is the way we look at each other. We are changing the world of business, creating a world where respect and dignity come first, where success is shared, and where every person, no matter their position, is valued. The billionaire's voice grew stronger as he spoke, the conviction in his words ringing clear. "I've been fortunate to have power, to have wealth, but I have come to realize that true power lies not in what you own, but in how you treat others. In a world where profits and margins often overshadow people's lives, we must choose to be different. We must choose to value people over profits. This is the future I am committed to." The audience was silent, and then a slow ripple of applause began, growing louder with each passing second. The billionaire felt a sense of pride wash over him. He had not just delivered a speech, he had shared a vision, a new way of thinking. But as the applause echoed through the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The changes he had made were still in their infancy, and the world he was trying to build was still fragile. There would be setbacks, there would be resistance, but he knew that this was the right path. As the applause died down, he knew that the road ahead would be long. But for the first time in his life, he was ready for it. He had started with Maya, and now, he was taking this movement to the world. He stepped off the stage with a sense of purpose, knowing that the journey was far from over. The future he was building was not just a business empire, it was a world where everyone could stand with dignity, where everyone could be seen and heard, and that was the future worth fighting for. Months passed, and the changes the billionaire had fought for were slowly but surely taking root. The company culture, once dominated by the pursuit of profit at all costs, had transformed into something more human, more compassionate. Employees were no longer treated as faceless workers, but as individuals deserving of respect and dignity. The new initiatives had begun to show real results. Productivity had increased, Employee morale was higher than it had been in years, and the company's reputation in the industry was slowly but steadily improving. Yet, the billionaire knew that even though the internal changes were monumental, there was still work to be done. The world outside his company had yet to see the full impact of the transformation he had set in motion. As he sat in his office one evening, reflecting on the progress, he knew that true change would require more than just company-wide policies. It would require a movement, one that went beyond the walls of his empire, reaching into communities, touching the lives of people who had long been overlooked. It was time to take the next step. The billionaire gathered a small group of like-minded leaders, people from different industries, non-profit organizations, and government positions to help him launch a new initiative, a nationwide campaign for workers' rights, dignity, and respect. He knew that if he wanted to change the world, he had to inspire others to join him. As the initiative was announced, there was skepticism in the air, but for the first time in his life, he was ready for it. He had started with Maya, and now, he was taking this movement to the world. He stepped off the stage with a sense of purpose, knowing that the journey was far from over. The future he was building was not just a business empire, it was a world where everyone could stand with dignity, where everyone could be seen and heard, and that was the future worth fighting for. Productivity had increased, employee morale was higher than it had been in years, and the company's reputation in the industry was slowly but steadily improving. Yet, the billionaire knew that even though the internal changes were monumental, there was still work to be done. The world outside his company had yet to see the full impact of the transformation he had set in motion. Some thought it was just another publicity stunt, another billionaire trying to look good in the eyes of the public. But this time, it was different. The billionaire wasn't just talking about change, he was actively leading it. Maya, who had become a trusted advisor and a symbol of the movement, stood by his side as they traveled across the country to speak with workers from all walks of life. Maya listened intently, her face reflecting the emotions of each person she spoke with. The billionaire watched her as she took in each story, her resolve hardening with every word. She had always been the one to remind him that this wasn't just about policies or speeches, it was about real lives, real people who had been fighting for a chance to be seen and heard. The campaign grew, gaining traction in cities and towns across the country. People began to rally behind the message of dignity and respect for workers. Businesses, governments, and nonprofits started to take notice. Some were resistant to the changes, fearing that it would disrupt the status quo, but the billionaire was undeterred. He knew that change wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He continued to push forward, knowing that the impact of his actions would ripple out far beyond his company. Then, one day, a call came in that would change everything. The billionaire was notified that a major corporation, one that had long been a competitor, had reached out. They had seen the progress that the billionaire's company had made, the positive changes in the workforce, and they wanted to join the movement. It was an unexpected development, but one that filled the billionaire with hope. If one major corporation could join the cause, others would follow. And that's exactly what happened. More companies began to adopt similar policies, prioritizing their workers' well-being and dignity. The movement spread like wildfire. What had started as a single person's vision, Maya's vision, had grown into something larger than anyone could have imagined. It was no longer just about one company or one billionaire. It was a movement for a new way of doing business, a way that respected every worker, from the janitor to the CEO, from the factory worker to the teacher. The billionaire stood at the podium once more, this time before a crowd of thousands at a national summit. The room was filled with leaders from all over the world, business owners, government officials, nonprofit directors, and workers. The air was electric with anticipation. He had spoken before, but today felt different. Today, he was not just a businessman. He was a leader in a movement that was changing the world. "This is our moment," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "We've seen the change. We've felt the shift. But this is just the beginning. The true measure of success isn't how much we accumulate, but how much we uplift. It's not about the wealth we amass, but the dignity we give to others. And together, we are proving that a business can thrive not just by making profits, but by making people's lives better." The room erupted into applause. The billionaire stood there, feeling the weight of what had been accomplished. But he also knew that the real work was just beginning. The change had started, but it was up to all of them to continue it, to make sure that no worker was ever overlooked again, to build a world where dignity and respect were the foundation of every business, every community, and every life. The billionaire stood on the balcony of his office, gazing out at the sprawling city beneath him. It was a clear evening, the lights of the city flickering like stars across the horizon. He could feel the weight of the journey he had embarked on pressing down on him, but there was also a sense of satisfaction in the air. What had once been a lofty idea, a distant hope for change, had become a reality. His company had transformed, and with it, the lives of countless workers. He had kept his promises, and in doing so, had created a culture that was more compassionate, more human. But he knew that the world was far from perfect. There was still much work to be done. The changes within his company were just the beginning. The movement he had started was still growing. But it needed more to thrive. It needed more than just corporate leaders and CEOs to join in. It needed a collective effort from every corner of society to truly make a lasting impact. The billionaire had seen the power of grassroots movements, the power of people standing together for a common cause. He had learned that true change didn't come from the top down, but from the ground up. He had met with workers from all walks of life, heard their stories, understood their struggles. It had been those conversations, those personal connections, that had opened his eyes. He couldn't stop now. The initiative had spread across the country, but he wanted to take it further. He wanted to take it global. He began meeting with international leaders, business magnates, and even heads of state to discuss the power of dignity in the workplace. The response was overwhelming. More and more countries were eager to adopt the policies that he had put in place. Businesses began to rethink how they treated their employees, recognizing that their workers were not just assets to be used, but people deserving of respect and fair treatment. As the billionaire traveled the world, he saw firsthand the difference his movement was making. In factories in Asia, workers were now being paid a fair wage and given better working conditions. In Europe, businesses were investing in their employees' education and personal growth. In South America, companies were starting to offer health benefits to their workers, something that had never been offered before. But it wasn't just about business. The billionaire also saw the impact on families. Parents were able to spend more time with their children, not forced to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. Children were able to go to school without worrying about whether their parents would come home exhausted and angry. The sense of hope that had spread from his company was now touching lives on a global scale. However, despite the success, there were still pockets of resistance. Some businesses, especially those in industries with low profit margins, were struggling to adapt to the new model. They argued that paying workers more and offering better benefits would hurt their bottom lines. The billionaire understood their concerns, but he also knew that there was a greater price to pay for ignoring the dignity of workers. He wasn't naive. He knew that some businesses might never adopt these changes, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had started a conversation, that he had sparked a movement, and that movement was growing. One day, as he sat in a conference room in London, preparing for another round of meetings with international leaders, Maya walked in. She had become a global ambassador for the movement, traveling with the billionaire to speak at summits, meet with leaders, and inspire others to join the cause. She had grown into a powerful force in her own right, her voice commanding the attention of people from all over the world. "Are you ready for today?" she asked with a smile. The billionaire looked at her, pride welling up inside him. He had watched her grow from the quiet girl who had sparked his transformation to the confident, outspoken leader she was now. "Ready," he said, his voice filled with purpose. "Let's show them what we can do." As they stepped onto the stage, the room filled with the hum of anticipation. This wasn't just another business conference. This was a turning point in history. They were about to show the world that businesses could succeed while also lifting people up. They were about to prove that profitability and respect for workers weren't mutually exclusive. As the billionaire and Maya took their places at the podium, the crowd fell silent. The billionaire knew this moment was bigger than just them. It was about the millions of people whose lives had already been changed by this movement, and the millions more who would benefit in the years to come. "This is not just a business model," the billionaire began, his voice strong. "This is a way of life, a way of doing business that doesn't sacrifice people for profit. It's about showing the world that true success comes when we put people first, when we respect their dignity, give them opportunities to grow, and treat them as partners, not commodities. The crowd erupted into applause, but the billionaire knew that the real work had only just begun. The movement was growing, but there were still obstacles to overcome. Still, he was filled with hope. As he looked out at the crowd, he saw the future, a future where businesses thrived not just because they made money, but because they made the world a better place. And he knew that, with Maya by his side and the movement growing stronger every day, that future was within reach. The billionaire stood in front of the vast window in his office, the city's skyline stretching out before him. The streets below were alive with motion, a symbol of the world he had once tried to control. But now, everything seemed different. His company had transformed, his legacy was evolving, and the lessons he had learned through Maya and the countless workers he had met had reshaped his perspective on success. He had spent a lifetime chasing wealth, but now he realized that true wealth was not in what he could amass, but in what he could give back. The movement that had started within the walls of his company was no longer just about changing business practices. It had become a global shift in how people viewed each other, how businesses viewed their employees. And it was only growing. He had built an empire, but this empire, built on dignity and respect, was stronger than any he had ever known. Maya had shown him the way, and together, they had created a movement that was changing lives. But as he looked out at the world, he knew that the work was far from finished. There were still millions of people whose lives had not yet been touched by the changes they had started. The ripple effect they had created needed to continue spreading. The billionaire turned away from the window, his gaze meeting the walls of his office that had once been filled with the trappings of success. Now, those walls seemed to reflect a different kind of power, a power that didn't come from wealth, but from the ability to inspire change. He smiled to himself. He knew that Maya had changed him. She had shown him that people were not simply numbers or tools to be used, they were the heart of everything. And now, the world was seeing that too. The billionaire had already begun making plans for his next step. He had met with global leaders, pushing for worker rights and business reforms across borders. It was time to take the message beyond business conferences and boardrooms. It was time to build partnerships, to create a collective of businesses, organizations, and governments that would prioritize people first. He knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but he was no longer afraid. He had seen the strength in people who had been ignored for so long, and that strength gave him hope. He had seen how businesses could thrive when they treated their employees with respect, when they recognized the humanity behind every task. And now, he was going to help others see it too. He was going to show the world that when you put people first, everything else falls into place. Maya had always reminded him that this movement wasn't just about policy, it was about humanity. It was about treating others as you would want to be treated. The billionaire had learned that the world didn't need more leaders who ruled from the top, it needed leaders who walked alongside others, who understood that success was a shared experience, not an individual triumph. And as the billionaire sat back in his chair, looking over the plans he had set in motion, he knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. The movement was already growing beyond anything he could have imagined, and with Maya by his side, he knew it would continue to spread. Together, they had created something that would outlast them both. It wasn't just about a company anymore, it was about a world where dignity and respect were the foundation of everything. The billionaire had come a long way from the man he once was, the man who measured success in dollars and power. Now, he measured it in the impact he had on others, in the lives he had changed, and in the hope he had inspired. He knew there would always be more to do. There would always be more lives to touch, more barriers to break, but he was ready for the challenge. As he stood up from his desk, ready to take the next step in this journey, he looked out once more at the city below. It was a city full of people, full of dreams, full of potential. And now, it was a city where dignity and respect would no longer be optional, it would be the foundation of everything. This was the future. This was the world they had started to build. And the billionaire knew that he was no longer just a businessman. He was a part of something much bigger. He was part of a movement that would change the world. In this powerful tale, we follow the transformative journey of a billionaire who learns the true value of dignity, respect, and empathy through his encounters with black stories of hardworking individuals. After years of building an empire based solely on profits, he comes to realize that true success is not about wealth or power, but about lifting others up. The billionaire's encounter with Maya, a young girl who showed him the importance of standing up for one's worth, sparks a movement that reaches beyond corporate walls. As he changes his business practices, prioritizing employees' rights and dignity, he witnesses the power of Black stories that were once ignored, now being heard and valued. His efforts lead to a global shift in business practices, where respect for workers becomes the foundation of success. With Maya's guidance, the billionaire sets out to make lasting change in both his company and society, proving that the real measure of success lies in making a difference in people's lives. These Black stories highlight the resilience of individuals who fight for their dignity and their place in a world that too often overlooks them. As the billionaire's movement grows, it spreads a message of compassion, equality, and hope, reminding us all that our worth isn't defined by our position or power, but by our humanity. Through these stories, the billionaire learns to redefine what it means to lead, showing the world that leadership is about empowering others and valuing the unseen voices. The transformation is not just within one company, but across industries, as Black stories shape the future of business and inspire a more equitable world.